of all, of course, we need the science, so it's scientific. And then which scientists have demonstrated their integrity, that they follow through, even if they are to be deplatformed, lose their mortgage, lose their job, be killed, whatever it is. How much gut, how much values do they uphold as scientists? Or are they just an instrument of other forces and then in that case, the technical expertise doesn't cut it for me, you know?
There was only two ways, as Machiavelli said, to lead a people, right? Either through love or through fear. And fear is more successful, right? Now, if you wanted your people on your side and you had no fear component, think about it. Corporate world is driven by fear. The entire government is driven by fear. Everything we do is fear-based. But if you have no fear and you have love, you naturally are empathetic. You don't need to teach empathy in that way. But the whole problem we had in the West is the Industrial Revolution. And then before that, we had the Great Depression. People were so desperate to put food on the table. So welcome back, everybody. We're here on another episode of podcast that is developing, that has become very interesting. We're just dissecting language and understanding language, looking at all sorts of things. And the response on our previous episode was excellent. And so I'm really excited to have Adam back with us again. Hi, Adam. How are you doing?
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's been exciting. And I watched some reactions, and it was fascinating to read some insights, from people, and that it's being it's being received well, and some thoughtful reflections. So, and first of all, for me, it's also exciting just to even share with you and come up with some new ideas in the process. So great. I appreciate.
Well, I think that's what's really interesting is rather than an interview with an expert, it's two people that just know a few things and discussing and getting more ideas and further clarity. And I think more discussions of that nature helps us to build, as you mentioned in the last conversation, it's open communication without the ego attached, where we're just simply bringing what you've learned and what I've learned and seeing how we can enrich the experience and ultimately to benefit people. Because I really have, and I think we on the same page with this, where we really have a great desire to see people doing well rather than selling a book or an agenda or anything like that.
Yes, you know what? I was reading your post from today when you it was a bit personal, your story, how you thrive on helping others. And I was just kind of seeing myself in the story as well. Because that's how I always, when I wrote my cover letters for jobs to schools and stuff like that, I always kind of try to focus on this. I really enjoy seeing people doing well and helping them, and then it's like win-win, we win through other people's wins, and it's just a very nice organic way of helping yourself through helping others. And it seems to be our only option now that's sustainable. Everyone talks about sustainability, but also limited to context of the environment or something. But I think sustainability has to be first in consciousness itself, right? So yes, I think the whole idea of just having a conversation and being open to learning, even as feeling like a specialist in something. But I always felt like, as an educator, I'm more into learning than into teaching. I always only because I like learning so much, it just makes most sense if you end up teaching and mentoring and lecturing. That gives you an opportunity to learn more because you learn best when you teach. It's paradox, but yeah, I think the whole thing is I've always seen it as a process. And it's a kind of discovery. It's a process of collective discovery rather than preaching your expertise to anyone. So I think this mindset it's still quite fresh, it seems, in people's minds. Yeah, that people are used to looking up to authorities and just following some roadmap. And I think what we have to shift towards, okay, I know this, but where is my humility? How can I learn, like we said, how can I learn about my blind spots, and how can I learn about perspectives that I have never assumed might be out there from other people?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point that I also want to talk about is that people may confuse that for we need to become experts and we need to know everything. And I think humility, like you mentioned, is recognizing that other people who have something to add can really benefit us. I'm not a fan of the Western concept of we know what's best for our age and we'll do it our way. And it's sort of neglecting some of the wisdom. And for me, my whole teaching and my whole principle, and I know you've read extensively and researched extensively on people that we can learn so much from. So I keep this humble, open mind, but never assume that I'm in authority. And there's nothing wrong with being an authority either. It's just that the humble approach gets you much further. And regarding teaching, I find teaching the best way to understand the subject that I'm learning. So when I'm learning and I'm expressing it, I see all the holes in what I'm trying to express. And so when somebody asks me a question and say, "Well, I don't understand you. Could you elaborate?" And that gives me so much more insight to explain all those things that I didn't even see. And the most amazing thing for me is that my understanding of the subject becomes concrete. When I've understood it from reading a book, it is there, and I say, I've got it. And then I explain it to someone, and I realize I've conceptually understood it. And as I'm speaking, I'm realizing that there is this translation from the analytical understanding to the practical implementation or the experience of it. And again, that goes on to the teachings of traditional wisdom, which is in execution and in experience. And many people have forgotten about the benefits of a lived experience, a lived life, not a conceptually understood life, and not a rationally positioned life, but a life lived. And a life lived is a simple life, but a life conceptualized is extremely complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think starting with your first point about the West being kind of hyper specialized and hyper intellectualized, and this kind of Cartesian curse following us, and now we're hitting the wall, and it's like we have to break that frame and go out there and try to reframe our problem solving strategies and everything, because nothing's which used to work doesn't work anymore. But yeah, I think this is very interesting how Heidegger kind of builds a bridge for the two of us, because Heidegger is one of the in 20th century's most revolutionary philosophers, while feeding on, especially later Heidegger, on Eastern traditions and on mysticism, but translating it into the academic language, is in between the worlds. And I think that's why I was very fascinated by this sort of thinking. Obviously there are problems there is this Nazism and everything, and I wouldn't want to discard that, because he was a Nazi, and he did betray his mentor Husserl and so on and so forth. But that's another story. I'm happy to kind of also put explain my position on that. But the main thing is, going back to this topic, is that we have hyper specialized, and we ended up kind of really hyper focusing on any one area, which made us incapable of actually seeing a broader perspective. And so to see the world systemically and interdependence of all the disciplines, and especially, I think for me it's very important to see religion, language, and science as part of, how could they be on one team again? That's very important, because right now they are not. And we will need that if we are to live in a sustainable culture again. We will need science, religion, and culture be on one team. I believe Burkhardt was right about that, And in terms of teaching, I think there's another thing I was thinking about today as well. When, let's say, you're an expert, you're a technically trained expert in your field, but then like you said, do you embody the values of your discipline? Do you embody, are you ready to live by the principles that what you write about in the journal, in the article? Are you ready to demonstrate that in your life? And I think most of people would be swayed by various interests and kind of instrumental goals, right? So what we've seen, I think, through COVID as well, is like the whole discussion, the mainstream discussion was like, is it scientific or is it anti-scientific? Like, that's not a discussion. Discussion is like, okay, the first thing was when I was studying philosophy, and one of the modules in my MA was a moral philosophy, and we are studying these analytic examples of what might be, how does this moral theory work if we imagine this scenario, that scenario, and all of those scenarios try to be as scientific as possible. So you cut out any contingency, any unique, like in a novel, let's say you read Dostoevsky's novel and there are all those characters and you emotionally get involved with the story, and like Crime and Punishment or something, and you empathize with the murderer and the prostitute as the most moral, exemplars of moral code in this horrible society that they live in, and that really does something. But obviously, when you read these articles, they're completely dry. And then I spoke to my friends, colleagues on the course, and they're like, it has no bearing on reality. We study these things, then we write these essays, they're getting assessed, and then we're supposed to, and there we are assessed on, what are we assessed on? Are we more moral? Are we more ethical agents? I think I was just trying to write that, and I'm thinking, how can I even pretend to know what to say? How shall I argue? I need to embody, like you say, I want to internalize the theory. Let's say it's a utilitarianist ethic, whatever is, like, something is good if it brings a good consequence. So I want to internalize, I want to live it, I want to apply it to my life, and I want to experience consequences of living through this ethic. So it's a living embodied ethic, and then I can learn about my responses to it, and together with conceptual understanding, I can then continue having discussions and write an essay. Maybe then I can write a paper, and then that paper would have some weight. But if that paper is just an intellectual exercise of dry concepts, all I'm proving is that I'm qualified at writing a scientifically sounding paper rather than proving that I'm knowledgeable in morality, right? So it's this kind of, I think, this is what you said resonates with my experience, where there's this highly detached, intellectualized culture of, just ivory tower of being articulated and well articulated and educated and whatnot. And then that kind of becomes the priesthood of the paradigm, and people feel like the majority of people feel abandoned and alienated from their representatives. Because I think that's what made me not to choose go and do a PhD, because I thought I just don't really feel like I belong, in academia as a thing. And I thought, if I am to do philosophy, I want to meet people doing philosophy and learn about their philosophy and live it out and see how it works, in life.
Yeah. So that's really, really important and interesting, because looking at the word philosophy, which comes from two words, philosophy, which is love of wisdom, and right. Wisdom is the result of practical application. Knowledge, information, and wisdom are entirely different. Wisdom is the result of a lived experience, that's why you call a senior, older person a wise person, and you don't call someone who presents information to you that graduated with a degree wise. You may call them informed or knowledgeable, but wisdom is the love. Philosophy is the embodiment of that wisdom. And what you're referring to there about academics is exactly my point before, is that you won't see the flaws in your conceptual understanding unless you implement them. And as you're talking about them and implementing them, you start seeing all the holes in them, which you're right. would make an exceptional paper, because now this paper is a lived experience and now it has gravitas, like it has weight on it. Now, the point that you made about this thing about academics not having what Nassim Nicholas Towley, who wrote this book, Anti-Fragile and Black Swan, talks about, skin in the game. I believe it's also a book that he wrote, Skin in the Game. People do not have skin in the game. When it comes to leaders, when it comes to politicians, when it comes to academics, when it comes to scientists, when it comes to war leaders, right? Because you go and send your troops in, but are you leading it? And that's, again, I talk about in conventional warfare, it would be the guy who made the decision, who says, right, like men, we're going forward, and I'm leading the charge. Now, that would not require, this is the big thing, this is a big thing for me. You see, you don't need to develop trust. They have all these things on leadership and how to develop trust with your team. Why? Because you're not leading from the front. Because if you're leading from the front and you got your you've got your shield on and you got your sword in your hand, does your men need to know if they can trust you or not? When you're saying, I'm ready to die, are you coming with me? You don't need that, because the practical implementation and practice of it is not being done. And we saw all these politicians that were implementing these no mask policies, and they found them having parties and things like that where they weren't doing that. Again, when it comes to the whole scientific era, which is another big topic that we need to investigate very carefully, because like you said, the scientists have become the priest class. And we had the age of the magicians, we had the age of the storytellers, and the age that we're living in now is the age of the scientists. And they are the ones that who can produce the magic, except all of them have flaws in them. But we are about to transcend past the scientific era. But the only way we're going to transcend past of that is because the whole thing is about evidence-based living. If I say to you, you shouldn't sleep on your left side, you'd say, oh, that's a great idea. Why? Oh, my grandmother told me that. Okay, that's great. But if I say to you, science has proven, all I have to put is the word science has proven in front of you, and you'd say, well, from tonight I will be sleeping on the other side. My grandmother, inconsequential. That's just random. But when science says it, nobody says, okay, could you give me the analysis of that paper and how we got to it? Like, how do we get to the facts? Even then, you can never assess 7 billion people in that particular way. So every single study is a basic understanding of a sample of things. But it's, again, the last point is what you said about science coming together with culture, coming together with religion, is that it has to all come together, because science, we don't want to vilify science or vilify religion, right? The culture thing, I'm not sure how we're going to be able to transcend that, but I believe that it's the way that we see the world is how I would define it, the culture as. But it's we downplay wisdom, things from the past, knowledge of the past, just general wisdom that transcends scientific understanding, and then we've raised science up, but in the process we've put something else down, which is innate wisdom that has been carried around for generations, that has tremendous impact on our lives.
Yes, I agree again. And I think wisdom itself, it's obviously, you know what, for me there was an event in a way when the pandemic started. I started following around that time. A lot of what I say, also I was going to make a disclaimer, because a lot of what I say is informed by the 3 years of listening to the contemporary thinkers from the online space, associated with this kind of media group that emerged around that time before the pandemic, called Rebel Wisdom. So there's like Daniel Schmachtenberger, Jamie Wheel, John Vervaeke. So it's like scientific, like systems thinkers and cognitive, basically multidisciplinary, just interesting, fascinating people who understood or who understand the broader perspectives of things. And the guy who was, I think they finished the project, the Rebel Wisdom, at the end of last year. But the guy who founded the initiative was formerly working for BBC as a journalist and Channel 4 in Britain. So he had the professional kind of skills while kind of out, like heterodox approach, and he was really interested in the esoteric side of things while really being intellectually well, literate in the culture as it is, the mainstream culture. So the point is, what do I want to say? That leadership, you said. I think going back to leadership, I was actually thinking about similar. We're quite quantumly entangled, I think, because we share ideas, and then we kind of see each other online, and then it kind of feeds back somehow. So because I was reminiscing about that idea of leadership as in my own experience, yes, there is no space to be a leader in a way, because like as leadership as the corporate culture is colonizing all leadership, including political, growing in power so much, while the culture within the corporate system is followership, not leadership. People don't really question, well, from my experience, people are incentivized by the way the system works to question what's being dictated down to them from the top of the corporate ladder, from the structure of the organization. So you are being continuously from the lowest level when you join the company, you're being continuously conditioned to not ask difficult questions, because the big, the consistency of the whole thing depends on people not asking difficult questions. So then how are you supposed to ever develop as a leader in a true sense, while you say you're in front of the truth and you are supposed to lead the way in a true paradigm shifting sense, rather than just from a manager to super manager to president to whatever within one culture.
So carry on about this top-down approach, where the whole basis is that you don't ask difficult questions, because I think that's really valuable. So go on.
Right. Yes, I think I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've been offered leadership positions for the past, let's say, over a decade or more even. Yeah. In various organizations, but I never accepted it because I never identified with the ways things were, and I think that has forged my self-leadership in a way, because I never gave in to being in a role of representing something I don't identify with. But then that it just happens over and over again. And I think it's but it's never been the case that you needed to do it, I think, to be a leader in like the ultimate sense until now, right? Because now companies are really struggling to actually have leadership that like you say, a leader that could really build that trust, that could really have earn this authority, not impose authority from top down, but actually understand that what you have to do is to earn authority. I mean, for my little experience as an educator has been that I've learned that, although Hannah Arendt helped me with that, because that's the political philosophy, when she said, power is with the people who give authority to the leader. You don't assume authority, you earn it. And it with people, you have to win them over. You can't just assume. And I think when the crisis comes, there's this great a temptation to just to do things quickly and just impose things from the top. And what you're doing is you're destroying your authority. You're destroying the basis for leadership. And this was obviously what's happened. Now, far fewer people trust the political or scientific leadership now than they used to before the Corona crisis started. So I think we are in a way there's a big niche for proper leadership in the sense that you described it, yeah, where people organically learn to trust leader, but at the same time the whole structures are set up in the old way, so those leaders who are supposed to be so bold, they are outside the system in a way. So that's the paradox.
Well, you precisely hit the nail on the head. You want authentic leadership in a system that does not encourage authentic leadership. The whole leadership, if you look at all the posts online about, building trust, building rapport, how to analyze your team, is entirely in the wrong system. So you have a system that's based on the corporate framework. It's still, I read this wonderful article by a leadership consultant, and he said that it's an authoritarian system. Corporate leadership and corporate governance and the whole system, you think you're free. You're not. The whole thing is, if you look at what all these people have been saying from the early 20th century, this illusion of freedom, right? I mean, you've read some of Eric Fromm as well, right? So this whole thing about freedom and that I can do whatever I want is a hoax. And now you have these new age leadership consultants who are coming in with the whole empathetic approach. Like, we should take care of our people. And so leaders are trapped with sausages in their mouth, because they're sitting there going, okay, so the top down is telling me to implement these policies and these rules, and I'm not being humbled enough. And now you get these leadership gurus going, guys, your people need to come first. Excuse me, the people were always first. This is the biggest lie we've been sold. Empathy is not needed. It's absolute rubbish. You don't need, empathy is relatability. If you are one of the people, you don't need empathy. You don't have to teach someone empathy. If you're getting the same facilities and the same availability to everybody else, and you're not put onto a pedestal because you're different, you don't need empathy. Empathy is for someone who's in a different class to you, so you can relate to the common people. And they're saying that we have the flat file kind of a structure in leadership. We don't. But here's the thing, that my investigation, because I do leadership consulting as well, and there's something that really struck me, is that leadership coaches and mentors, they sell their products to employees, not to companies. This is how it works. They go to social media and write books and say, guys, we need empathy. People should do whatever they want, whenever they want, and we should respect our people. And the employees are going, I love this guy. Let's get him. Let's get him. And then they call their bosses and say, listen, you got that budget available for leadership consulting? Get this guy in. And this guy comes in. The leaders are sitting there going, what do they mean? How do you mean? Okay, so now someone comes up, the employee says, look, I'd like to take a month off and go to Bali. And the leader goes, no, you can't. And then the employee said, but you heard the leadership coach who came in here and you said you need to be empathetic. Okay, sure, take the month off. Who's going to take your place? So there's the impracticality of this. And think about this. If we could relate to employees, that's the whole thing, that it's a mind shift. And maybe you can help me to understand, because I don't get it. If everybody can do whatever they want, if you want to relate to an employee is a paid worker. He's there, she's there to take care of that particular role in order to sustain the company. The company depends on productivity, efficiency, profits, and scalability, and handling the competition and being number one. Now, if I had to apply that to my children and say, listen, you all want to do really well at school, but you know what? Forget about studying. I'm with you guys. If it was my way, nobody should study. So let's all have, fast foods for the whole week. Nobody needs to study. Now, where's the psychology? Where do you draw the line? And for me, I see a big difference between, so for me, that's why I went to look back. I'm like, okay, so we need to become empathetic. Where did this whole empathetic approach come from? Emotional intelligence. How did we need to learn about emotional intelligence? If you were a leader from 300 years ago and you had a military army and you wanted your people to work, there was only two ways, as Machiavelli said, to lead a people, right? Either through love or through fear. And fear is more successful, right? Now, if you wanted your people on your side and you had no fear component, think about it. Corporate world is driven by fear. The entire government is driven by fear. Everything we do is fear-based. But if you have no fear and you have love, you naturally are empathetic. You don't need to teach empathy in that way. But the whole problem we had in the West is the Industrial Revolution. And then before that, we had the Great Depression. People were so desperate to put food on the table. And a man came over them and said, listen, if you don't do this job, I'll fire you and the other guy will get to eat and you won't. So that's the culture we're coming from right now, an entirely fear-based, dependent system to now transitioning over to this extra empathetic approach. But there has to be a balance. It's not just about empathy. It's not just about emotional intelligence. It's this robustness. And the system itself does not aid in creating, like what you said, thought-provoking leadership that come out and say, guys, we're all talking about empathy here. How are we going to be number one if everybody gets to do whatever they want?
Right. So there's two things that come up for me from what you said. One thing is, because this is very useful, this is part of my work, how the ideology of empathy, I would call it, because there's empathy, which is, like we say, a natural human trait that really makes us human, and that's what we champion, actually. But when you turn it into an ideology, and it's just being cool and virtue signal, and it's just becoming something to share on social media and using empathy word everywhere, then it becomes corrupted. And you have people who don't even understand the value of discipline or self-discipline, that there has to be this balance, right? You must have empathy within the bounds of what has to be done. And if you don't hold yourself and others accountable, then everything goes, sideways. And then you said, what was the second thing? So the kind of emotional incontinence, I would say, rather than emotional literacy, because emotional literacy means that you actually understand, you can go through, especially as a man. I think for women, it might be easier. I'll be called sexist, but that's not what I mean. Like, my female friends know I'm not like that, but like, to be vulnerable with your own emotions is very unmanly. Again, our culture, we are being brainwashed by the culture, by the imagery of the marketing, and the man must be the macho and a woman must be sexy and so on. And I think the more you block the emotions, the less you are capable of actually having any awareness of your masculinity in a way. So I think it's quite a complex thing, but it's so easily distorted through these lenses of marketing yourself as a leader, vulnerable leader, empathetic leadership. All of that is just becoming a brand. And then what it actually does is it undermines the very structure of some sort of having the boundaries around your leadership, that having certain principles that have to be in place. I forgot about the other point.
We'll come to it, but just on the point that you're making right now is that we take terms and we don't understand the opposites of them, and that again goes back to our previous discussion on the Aristotelian type of thinking, or Cartesian, or the separation, this duality. So if I'm empathetic, then I can't be self-disciplined as well. So people, like, you find all these self-help people saying you should love yourself, but part of loving yourself is being extremely disciplined with yourself.
Absolutely.
So this is what D.T. Suzuki, an incredible Zen master, he says that you need rituals, you need structure in order to have freedom. You cannot become free without the rules and regulations. In other words, when you go to your Zen practice, you got to change your clothes, you got to sit on that cushion, you got to block out all the noise, and you got to be disciplined. And if you're not, the Zen master will come to you, give you a slight whack on the shoulder saying, hey, focus. Now, is that called anger? And I did a post about that, and I talked about kindness. Kindness is a word that's been entirely misunderstood, and that's the point which I'd like to talk about with you, about language, because we people get very polarized and they say, oh, kindness, right, so let's do all these posts about dogs saving babies from drowning, right? And that's kindness. And then I did a post how in Japan or in the East, when they stop their children from doing things that they shouldn't do, that's kindness. Now, kindness does not equal niceness. What we want, that's again tied into the American understanding of an American is not specifically against America. I don't have any issues with any country whatsoever, but is this understanding of kindness being something that you don't want to become a bad person. Even in the language, look at the language. I always looked at this, and I remember asking a friend of mine. He asked me, "Would you like some drink?" And I said, "No, thanks, I'm good." He said, "You see what they did there? I'm good." What is you having a drink with having to be good? You having a drink, why does having to be good be involved in that? Because you see, if you refuse someone something, then you may be perceived as a bad person. So you add on, "I'm good." But there's no reason for you to say "I'm good" if intrinsically we don't care about good and bad in that situation, because everybody has their right to be individual. So saying no is just as acceptable as saying yes. And this is where we have this whole dialogue that you got to be a yes man. It's the same what you said in the corporate leadership as well. Say yes and you are good. But if you stand up, "Oh, he's bad," and that's the whole thing. So then it stops all the whole discussion. So everybody, so being good is attached to all these terrible negative consequences without the lack of self-expression, without us even realizing it.
Absolutely, and that makes us just not being able to say no, because I would go as far as to say the society I've been living in, the Western society in general, has been in a codependent relationship with the governments and with the corporate, brainwashing machine, basically, and the marketing industry and all of that. It's to say no, to draw a boundary and say, "No, thank you, I'm fine." You're crazy. You're supposed to be a soft, for me, I've been observing it, I've been reading about it, I've been living it. I've been living through the, educational system, both as an educator and as a student. And there's the neo-Marxist ideas that are now kind of proliferating through various, forms of ideologies, and this kind of cult of kindness and cult of unquestionable empathy with no self-restraint, no capacity of emotional regulation, and just basically to that we have all the technology and social media, which makes it completely dysregulates people together. People are born into it, and they just don't even have a mechanism to actually self-regulate, emotionally regulate. And that then is being weaponized again. The whole virtue signaling culture, that is then being weaponized, and people go to companies, and I hear about my friends who, one of my best friends, he's been in the music industry all his life, and now he works for this company in Warsaw, which used to be like a smaller company, but now they have these young people coming from Sony and EMI and all the big corporations, and they bring the culture of miscommunication and kind of virtue signaling on the outside, but when it comes to actually getting work done, they become very Machiavellian and very, unhealthy and toxic. And then what? And he finds himself in the minority. He's just about being 40 now, but he's seen before the internet, how he worked with musicians. He was a musician himself, successfully, and he knows that the music industry is about relationships, and you have to, artists want to feel loved, etc. And then those young guys come in because the company has to grow, because it has, like you said, the dominant culture becomes that kind of virtue signaling thing. And if you don't follow that, then you are being excluded from the system. So basically, you're not successful. If you want to be a successful leader, you stop being successful within the system, which has a self-terminating dynamic built into it through accepting all of those ideologically driven farce, really. It's nothing about it's nothing about genuine empathy or genuine goodness. It's like with kids, you know, when I work with my students, it's again, you have to have those boundaries, you have to have some principles, some rules, ground, so they feel secure, they know where they are. And I also saw quite a few in my time, teachers who just left really prestigious organizations, you know, like they were leaving because it became so liberal that they couldn't do their job. It's like, how can I'm not allowed to ask you about your homework because I'm just being oppressive, you know, like this. And people left because those are excellent teachers, excellent pedagogues with, you know, some of them with PhDs and people after Cambridge and Oxford, and they like, I can't do it. So on the other hand, I think this culture is, there seems to be a growing awareness of this being self-terminating, because like even this conversation is not going to be the very fact that we're making it public. We know that there's enough people and there's a growing number of people who desperately want to make sense of it and how to tackle that. You know, I think my new thing I will be doing with my clients is offering the service of how to actually draw that line and how to, as a leader, as the boss, you know, who have these people who threaten you with canceling you on social media and whatnot, but at the same time destroying the culture within your team. How should you communicate? How should you tackle and identify the you know, twisting language and twisting words to exploit your sympathies and exploit empathy for selfish gains? Because I think this has to be addressed, and there are few people who would have the gut. I think, you know, being the boss is a very tricky and isolating situation now, isn't it? Being the boss, you've been building a company for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and suddenly there's a culture where you are scared to draw the line with people who know very little about how the thing works. And if you don't, you are being called an exploitative capitalist and so on. And I've been on both sides, and I've studied Marxism. When I was a younger student, when I was a student, I really loved like the Frankfurt School. So I don't come from the kind of Republican or whatever political stance. I've explored and I've lived both ways. And when I lived in the UK at some point, I worked physically in Marina, making boats with guys, and so I have lived through, again, I always try to embody my philosophy, and now I see the weaponization of this human nature, which is kind of growing. Is the, you know, based leadership, which we discussed last time, which clearly we need, because that's a kind of more authentic and more felt and quality of relatedness that has to be there, but not in a toxic way where people are scared to draw the line. I think that the leaders of tomorrow will have to be able to withstand the backlash of being tough when going gets tough, and drawing the line, and then dealing with being cancelled, and dealing with maybe working on their own language skills and their own articulacy and education in manipulative types of communication and manipulative mind tricks of various kinds, because a lot of the time I find just lack basic knowledge of like human psychology, and they are scared because they can't really put the finger on it. They know something's bad, something's rotting, but how can they address it without having the technical knowledge of what is that person actually doing, what is the condition of that Machiavellian tactics going on in my team. And I think this is the niche where I find to be relevant now to address in leadership, education, and in general, like helping leaders to address that in a way that is not aggressive, or is not that it's humane, and it's professional. So you can address it being specific and giving feedback that is specific and precise, and not simply reacting.
Yeah, I think that would be the case, and we have to approach leaders from a different angle, because instead of us saying being empathetic towards people, and of course the same applies to students, there is an understanding of employees and an understanding of students, but then there's also an understanding of bosses or leaders and teachers as well. Because what will end up happening is what you see with the teachers as well, saying, well, I'm not going to do this anymore and I'll go start my own little business. So anybody who has innate abilities is going to just say, I'm just not going to do this. To me, it's just not worth my trouble. And then corporates are losing their best people because of a toxic understanding. And yet employees are complaining about a toxic culture, yet they don't know what toxicity is. They don't understand the game behind what's going on, and rightfully so. They don't understand human psychology. They don't also understand how social media and the use of language is manipulating the person on the street to cause themselves to lose out. When the students say, don't give me homework, you're being a narcissist, it's their favorite word about everything. You're a narcissist and you're out. And the same with employees as well. You can't tell me what to do. You're a narcissist. So in that way, the people that really matter are going to leave. And who's going to lose out? The companies are going to lose out. The employees are going to lose out with the best of the best. And so will students lose out. And of course, from a societal level, nobody's going to say what they want to say. And this is the big question of authenticity that I want to explore next with you, because authenticity to me is misunderstood in such a big way. What does it mean to be authentic? It's not really understood in leadership. It's not really understood in human communication as well. So going on that point about leadership and what you were saying, for me, the most important thing is that we have to call a spade a spade. We have to call things what they are. And the naming of things is not correct, and that confuses us all. If we say, okay, well, you're not here to lead, what you're here to do is to appease the people and pretend like this is what you're actually doing here. When I was in a management role. So what you should be telling me is that I'm supposed to tell these people that they can do whatever they want, but I can't actually be honest with them, because if they don't do what they're supposed to do, we get to fire them. So the leader's in this little sandwich here. So on the one hand, he's supposed to be empathetic and kind and convincing and let people do whatever they want. But on the other hand, he's got to implement the system that's very authoritarian and driven by profits, driven by sustainability, driven by KPIs and all these other types of measures. And they're not all evil, because there's this huge thing about saying measuring people is evil. Okay, well, if it's evil, then we should throw out all exams, we throw out all assessments, and then we have a flat file structure, and then nobody gets rewarded based on merit.
Yeah, sure. I think I've been really trying to, over the last 2 years or so, to really distinguish between an individual within a company and the company as this corporate fiction that has this logo, and and people happen to define themselves in terms of that logo, because perhaps for me it's easier because I've always been a rebel and an outcast. So it's easier for me to make that step. And it's like, well, if I disagree with the whole thing, how I am assessed in the eyes of doing well within a company, then I just leave and I can start on my own. But I think the majority of people have never had it, so they don't have the mechanism to actually assert themselves. And then the question of authenticity and narcissism, I think these are terribly conflated concepts, because it's basically, to be authentic. What does it mean? It can mean anything. You can be an authentic murderer, you can be an authentic saint. But I suppose when it makes sense in a common sense kind of understanding of it, is that authentic means, like, if you say something, you also do that, and you try to live as with integrity. I think that's my understanding of being authentic. Yeah, and trying to follow your heart while being aware of your naivety at the same time. So you want to be.
I think it's very related to the subject and the environment in which you ask that question. Just like how you mentioned, if you're authentic as a murderer, and you would say what you're going to do, then you go around killing people, and you'd be authentic, right? So that wouldn't really, you wouldn't want authenticity in that particular way. But it's how we use the word authenticity, as we use the word empathy and kindness, to manipulate and to force you into becoming something that you don't want to be. So part of authenticity, where they talk about authentic leadership, authentic living, and all the rest of it, is, to them, is buying in to the status quo. So we say to you, this is what it means to be authentic. Like, you'll see all these posts saying, this is what a bad boss is, and this is what a good leader is. So a bad boss is not authentic, and a good leader. Boss and leader is the same damn word. They're just throwing it around. And they're changing the context of it. So we say, an authentic leader lets people do whatever they want. A boss tells people what to do.
It's an authoritarian. So it's all distorted through the lens of implicit Marxist presumptions, I would say. You know, for me, the penny dropped. That's why I'm not really scared anymore. Because by the way, I got cancelled multiple times. Once you got cancelled a couple of times, you build immunity against getting cancelled, and you realize it becomes part of your reputation, that's your style, and I'm ready to get cancelled. I think speaking my mind in the least confrontational way as I can, but authentically, is more important than any given reputation by whoever, you know. And now, like I said, let's say over about 10 years ago, I had a big crisis when I was around, like 2010-ish, that time. I was between like moving from the leaving the care work industry and moving, thinking about moving to education, but then I was still studying music, like a fork, you know, a fork in my kind of journey before moving to London. And I got really heavily into critical theory in the Frankfurt School and Erich Fromm, you know, so that's those people, they were all Marxists, but they also like Nietzsche. So because Nietzsche was so influential, you know, so I liked the kind of radical tone of these writings, the Dialectic of the Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer, and you know, Fromm, the amazing work, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, because I was trying to understand why I was playing in bands and playing metal and screaming and leading as a band, you know, leader as well, and kind of thinking, what drives me? Why do I need this kind of anger, this kind of hatred, you know, and aesthetics in music, but still, like, what? And I was reading, funnily enough, that was the time when for a couple of years I finished BA in music production and decided, instead of going to some useless kind of office entry job, I decided to go and work on boats, because I lived in Plymouth in England. So I was doing physical work, you know, and it was very interesting. I learned, like, you know, just to engage with how tired you actually are as a worker. And as I was a worker, after music, because what can you do after music? You just do whatever, you know, you can do with you're not really specialized for any branch of the market specifically, unless you really you just go into music industry, but not in Plymouth. So I ended up basically working physically while reading critical theory, which was all about the Marxist kind of 20th century account, you know, in kind of post-World War II, also looking at the totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and quite sophisticated, but also like quite radical in tone. So there was this Nietzschean aspect of kind of rock and roll in it, you know, which I liked. And then, like 3 years later, I ended up qualifying for getting into IOE to do my PGCE for being a teacher. And I ended up kind of exploring several departments within like University of London and you know, in London. With all that Marxism, I was well read, more read than most of my colleagues. So I was doing very well in terms of assignments, but then I started to realize that almost every lecturer has left-wing views. And I was thinking, I love that stuff, but hang on a minute, there's something not right. Like, they cared less about me making sound arguments than sharing my views, that I'm sharing, you know, I was endorsing what they already believed. And I felt accepted. So there was the sympathy, but I also like, as the time went, and then there was like the Jordan Peterson incident, right, with the pronouns, and a few years later, and I'm thinking like basically the whole education is made of Marxists. And then there's this guy Peterson talking about that's the case in Canada and America. It's like, so hang on a minute, like I love this stuff. I like the writing. That's why I'm quite I understand the merits of Marxist philosophy, and there's a lot of good stuff about it, but it just got distorted. And all of those people, not the lecturers, obviously, I mean, to some extent, they all had one view, which was worrying. I mean, as a philosophy postgraduate and emerging educator. But what I was wondering about is that those other people who didn't read those books, they had never read all that literature. They already assumed dogmatically that their mindset, watered down version of Marxism, that is in the policies, in educational policy and all of that's just the truth, and I'm like, wow, this is a serious dogma. And I started digging into it, and as the kind of VUCA situation emerged, the whole idea about after the pandemic, where people started talking about VUCA leadership and complexity and uncertainty and all of that. And some speakers gently that I've observed in the business world started to address this in a way that, you actually have to, that there's a great need in leadership to return to some sort of common sense boundaries, and not just allow, not just anything goes. It's just the recipe for destruction of the whole civilization, really. Because if we have capitalism driving the system, and you undermine and you get this virus of Marxist ideology without any understanding of the real literature behind it, but just the watered down kind of mainstream ideas about it and slogans driving people's actions, and then you have social media to scale it up, then I'm like, well, this is really a social engineering, some sort of disaster, social engineering, undermining the foundations of what the society should be, and what all the civilization should be. A functional civilization should have services that provide quality, and like you say, if you have more and more anything goes, then it becomes a cronyist system, where the more qualified leave it because they can afford to start something on their own, whereas what you get is these people who never say no, but then you get lesser qualified people within your company, which undermines the very integrity and success of the company. So yeah, that's how, through the lens of Marxist ideology, I see this whole predicament in business right now.
Yeah, so I think that's a topic that we should explore, the Marxist ideology in the modern day and how it's being utilized. And a lot of people have no idea deep down about Marx or about Marxism in that particular way, and the different interpretations of them. And it would be good, instead of doing an entire analysis on Marxism, but what we can benefit from it and how it's dangerous and all those types of things, and how it's influenced our modern day situation. That would be something to explore along with authenticity in the most meaningful of ways. And then the topic that is really a hot potato right now is AI, and that's what we should be talking a lot about, or having serious conversations about. If we are stuck here without the insertion in the general populace of generative AI dictating our logic and our reactions and our decision making, now happening in courts and with judges and people using generative AI to formulate structures, cases, win arguments. AI is going to tell you how to what to tell your girlfriend, or how to tell your boss that you can't work there anymore, and it's very, very convincing. And people are using this all the time. So if we're not up to date with all of these facts and how language and how we use language to this current time, we're not going to be able to navigate this, not just as leaders, but as individuals. And so there's a topic we should explore next and really dig deep into a solution or into another way, a new human being, the new nomos, right? It's a new dialogue, it's a new language, it's a new human being that would have to emerge. And I'm not talking, Nietzschean style or any of those sorts of understandings, but someone that is so vested and concerned about the human race, not trying to become an elitist, but somebody who's so understanding of the deep fear that we've got going into the future if we continue to live like that in all these different aspects. And that would be something that we will explore next, but we're out of time for this particular episode. But yeah, any last thoughts?
Yes, I agree totally. With AI, I think, as you know, I've been doing work on this, and I think people have been talking about the decision making and kind of outsourcing our agency to this generative, large language modules, and so that is already a threat. And then I haven't had anyone talking about, for me as a linguist, I think the most obvious one is destruction of language, in fact, because conceptual language, because it will be more and more convenient and to outsource our language, and it will be more and more capable of doing, less and less petty and more advanced linguistic tasks. And that is, for me, collapse of literacy. And once we cannot...
And relationships, sorry, I have to add...
And relationship, because
literacy is one thing.
Yeah, so there's decision making, then there's the intimacy, which is the relationship. We will be more and more vulnerable to deception. Is that what I call exponential deception, because it's just becoming better than capacity to discern it, already past the Turing test. And then there's the loss of literacy on the cultural level. So there's psychosocial level,
on intimacy as well, and on literacy.
Intimacy it's the relational level, and then there's there's basically literacy that's like a cultural level, because but it happens every time you have a collapse of civilization, which I believe this is. Perhaps it won't be as brutal as like last 2,000 years ago, like the collapse of Bronze Age empires, but it is as significant in terms of a shift, I think. And maybe the inflection point won't be as brutal. I don't know. I mean, I'm speculating, but I think certainly. Sorry.
I think it'd be worse than the Bronze
It
Age.
could be worse. Sure, yeah, that's another discussion. But I think my point is that the modes of literacy, I've just had this conversation with Dr. Vanessa Camilleri this morning, talking about literacy from University of Malta. Is like we have the modes of literacy we have had until now are becoming incompatible with the cognitive demands that are emerging. And now, how to bridge these cognitive demands with the prosthesis of using AI as a means to make sense of, because otherwise we don't have biological capacity to make sense of things unless we everything is mediated already through AI. Even our own consciousness, we already interface through getting our information and having stuff curated to us. So I think loss of literacy, that intimacy predicament, and what was the third one? And the decision making, right? So loss of agency. These three elements: AI and business, and not only business. This is like existential level. This is, like you said, human individuals as communities and as friends and so on, families, and So I think the best thing, my strategy, is to try, read and write as much as I can. I don't treat it as a leisure anymore, as pleasure. I just treat it as gym, as something that we'll have to cultivate, because it'll be harder and harder. And I think reading and writing in a traditional sense might be, like it once was, a very unique skill, because the new literacy will, or like whatever the digital paradigm will dictate again, it to be, because that will be the most economically viable thing to develop. within individuals. But then there will be the possibly a class of people who are committed to, reading and writing, and therefore thinking, because without that you can't think. If you don't write, your second order thinking depends on you being able to see what you've written and evaluate it, whether how much BS and how much true or accurate it is. So once we lose that and we just in the kind of flow of images and digital and virtual environments where anything goes again, there's complete detachment of agency, I think, and it's just like hyper real matrix like vertigo of experiences. So it's fascinating because all the philosophy kind of comes to life now, and we can actually discuss and observe the reality through the lens of all the theory that some of the more cutting edge thinkers were coming up with in 20th century, like Baudrillard, for example. I'd love to talk about him as well. It's fascinating.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there because we will not stop talking because it's always so riveting. So many layers. I'm really glad, I really enjoy our conversations, and I will get this out, and I can't wait to have our next discussion.